The morning mist hung thick around Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at her bedroom window, watching the early shift guards take their positions. She had been planning this moment for weeks, studying their routines, memorizing their patrol patterns, and identifying the one person who might help her achieve what seemed impossible, a completely private escape from the golden cage that had become her life. Detective Inspector Sarah Mills adjusted her earpiece as she began her security briefing. As head of the princess's protection detail, Sarah had noticed subtle changes in Catherine's behavior over the past month. The princess had been asking more questions about staff schedules, showing unusual interest in service corridors, and requesting detailed explanations about emergency evacuation procedures. Most concerning was her recent habit of taking long walks in the palace gardens, always alone, always following the same route that happened to pass by the least monitored entrance. Thomas Hartwell had been a royal protection officer for 15 years, and in all that time he had never received a personal request from a member of the royal family. So when Princess Catherine approached him during a quiet moment in the East Corridor, his initial reaction was complete bewilderment. She spoke in hushed tones, explaining that she needed to attend a private medical appointment that couldn't appear on any official schedule. The princess emphasized that this was a matter of personal health that required absolute discretion, and she specifically chose to confide in Thomas because of his reputation for integrity and his understanding of what it meant to protect someone's privacy. The weight of her request settled heavily on Thomas's shoulders. Catherine explained that she had tried to arrange the appointment through official channels, but every attempt had been met with requests for security details, medical documentation, and scheduling conflicts that would have made the appointment public knowledge. She needed to see a specialist about a private matter that she wasn't ready to discuss with anyone else, including her own protection team. The princess assured Thomas that she would only be gone for 3 hours and that her absence could be covered by claiming she was resting in her private quarters, with instructions not to be disturbed. Catherine had done her homework thoroughly. She knew that Thomas had a daughter who had struggled with mental health issues and that he had personally experienced the importance of medical privacy. She also knew that he was scheduled to work the east entrance during the afternoon shift change, when foot traffic was minimal and camera coverage had a brief blind spot due to a maintenance issue that hadn't been resolved. The princess had timed her request perfectly, approaching Thomas when he was alone and unlikely to be overheard. The conversation lasted only 5 minutes, but it would change both of their lives forever. Catherine spoke with a vulnerability that Thomas had never seen from any royal family member. She explained that the constant scrutiny had made it impossible for her to address certain personal health concerns, and that the stress of living under constant observation was becoming overwhelming. She wasn't asking him to abandon his duty to protect her, but rather to help her protect herself in a different way. The princess made it clear that she would take full responsibility if anything went wrong, and that she would never implicate Thomas in any wrongdoing. Thomas found himself facing an impossible choice. His training told him to refuse the request and immediately report it to his superiors. His duty was to protect the princess, and allowing her to leave the palace unaccompanied went against every protocol he had ever learned. However, something in Catherine's voice convinced him that refusing her request might cause more harm than granting it. She spoke about the suffocating nature of constant protection, about feeling like a prisoner in her own life, and about needing just a few hours to feel like a normal person addressing a normal problem. The days following their conversation were tense for both Catherine and Thomas. The princess continued with her normal schedule, attending official engagements and maintaining her public persona, while privately finalizing the details of her escape plan. She had already arranged the medical appointment under an assumed name, secured private transportation that wouldn't be traceable to the royal household, and identified a safe location where she could change clothes and disappear into the crowd of central London. Thomas, meanwhile, struggled with his conscience. He had served the royal family faithfully for over a decade, and the thought of violating his oath weighed heavily on his mind. However, he also recognized that his primary duty was to the well-being of the people he protected, and it seemed clear that Catherine's mental and emotional health were suffering under the current circumstances. He began to notice small signs of stress in her behavior, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, her tendency to check exits wherever she went, and her increasing reluctance to engage in spontaneous conversations with staff. As the day of the planned escape approached, Both Catherine and Thomas became acutely aware of how many people were involved in even the smallest aspects of royal life. Every movement was noted, every schedule was coordinated, and every deviation from routine was immediately questioned. The princess had to carefully arrange her afternoon schedule to create the window of opportunity she needed, claiming a private rest period that would give her the time to leave and return undetected. The morning of the escape arrived with typical London weather: overcast skies and intermittent drizzle that would actually work in their favor by encouraging people to move quickly and avoid lingering outdoors. Catherine woke earlier than usual, her mind racing through every detail of the plan. She had practiced the route through the palace corridors multiple times, timing each segment to ensure she could reach the east entrance during the brief window when Thomas would be alone and the security cameras would be repositioning. Thomas reported for duty that morning with a sense of impending doom. Part of him hoped that the princess would change her mind and abandon the plan, while another part of him understood that she needed this moment of freedom more than she needed his protection. He had spent sleepless nights considering the potential consequences of his actions, knowing that discovery could mean the end of his career and possible criminal charges. However, he had also witnessed the gradual deterioration of Catherine's spirit under the constant pressure of royal life, and he believed that helping her might be the most important thing he would ever do in his role as her protector. The palace was bustling with its usual afternoon activity as Catherine made her final preparations. She had chosen simple, unremarkable clothing that would allow her to blend into any crowd, and she carried only essential items that couldn't be traced back to her royal identity. The princess had even considered the possibility that she might be photographed or recognized, preparing a cover story that would minimize the damage to the royal family's reputation while protecting Thomas from any blame. As the designated time approached, both Catherine and Thomas felt the weight of what they were about to do. For the princess, this represented a chance to reclaim a small piece of her humanity and address a personal issue without the entire world watching. For Thomas, it was an act of compassion that went against everything he had been trained to do, but which he believed was ultimately in the best interest of the person he had sworn to protect. Neither of them could have predicted how this moment would change their lives and challenge everything they thought they knew about duty, loyalty, and the price of living in the public eye. The clock in the East Corridor showed exactly 2:47 p.m. when Catherine made her move. She had timed this moment perfectly, knowing that the afternoon shift change created a brief window of opportunity when the usual security protocols would be momentarily relaxed. Thomas Hartwell stood at his assigned post, his heart pounding as he watched the princess approach from the opposite end of the corridor. To any observer, it would appear to be a routine encounter between a royal family member and a security officer, but both of them knew this moment would determine whether their carefully planned operation would succeed or fail spectacularly. Catherine moved with practiced composure, her years of royal training helping her maintain a calm exterior despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. She carried a small messenger bag that contained everything she would need for her clandestine journey: a change of clothes, identification documents that wouldn't immediately link her to the royal family, and cash that couldn't be traced through electronic transactions. The princess had even considered the smallest details, choosing shoes that would be comfortable for walking but wouldn't draw attention in an urban environment. As she reached Thomas's position, Catherine paused and engaged him in what appeared to be a casual conversation about palace security. To anyone watching the security monitors, this would look like a routine discussion between the princess and one of her protection officers. However, their words carried a completely different meaning as they finalized the last-minute details of her escape. Thomas discreetly handed her a security card that would allow her to bypass certain electronic locks, while Catherine confirmed the timing of her return and the signal she would use to let him know she was safely back in the palace. The next few minutes unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Thomas guided Catherine through a series of service corridors that were rarely used by anyone other than maintenance staff and delivery personnel. These passages, originally designed to allow servants to move through the palace without being seen by royal residents, now served the opposite purpose, allowing a member of the royal family to move unseen by everyone else. The princess marveled at these hidden spaces within her own home, realizing how much of the palace's architecture remained a mystery even to those who lived there. They encountered only 2 staff members during their journey through the service areas, and both interactions went exactly as planned. Thomas had anticipated these encounters and prepared explanations that would satisfy any curiosity without raising suspicions. When they passed a housekeeping supervisor, Thomas simply mentioned that he was showing the princess some of the palace's historical features as part of a security assessment. When a maintenance worker looked up from his repairs, Thomas nodded and continued walking, as if this were a perfectly normal patrol route. The most challenging moment came as they approached the east entrance, where the security systems were most sophisticated and the risk of detection was highest. Thomas had studied the camera positioning and timing for weeks, identifying a brief window when the automated systems cycled through their rotation patterns. The princess would have approximately 90 seconds to move from the service corridor to the entrance door without being captured on any recording device. This timing required perfect coordination and absolute precision. Catherine felt a surge of adrenaline as Thomas signaled that the moment had arrived. She moved swiftly but naturally through the blind spot, reaching the entrance door just as Thomas disabled the exit alarm system. The door opened silently, revealing the outside world that suddenly seemed both familiar and completely foreign. For the first time in months, Catherine would step outside without an entourage, without photographers documenting her every move, and without the constant awareness that her actions were being scrutinized by millions of people around the world. The transition from the controlled environment of the palace to the bustling streets of London was jarring. Catherine had forgotten what it felt like to be surrounded by people who weren't paid to pay attention to her, who didn't recognize her face, and who were completely absorbed in their own lives and concerns. The anonymity was both liberating and terrifying, as she realized how much she had come to depend on the protective bubble that usually surrounded her. Thomas watched through a small window as Catherine disappeared into the crowd, his heart racing as he considered the magnitude of what they had just accomplished. The princess had successfully escaped from one of the most secure locations in Britain without triggering a single security alert or arousing any suspicion among the palace staff. However, this was only the beginning of their challenge. Catherine now had to navigate London on her own, while Thomas worked to maintain the illusion that she was safely inside the palace. The cover story they had prepared required Thomas to manage several different aspects of the deception simultaneously. He needed to ensure that no one attempted to contact the princess directly, that her scheduled rest period wasn't interrupted, and that any routine security checks would appear normal to his colleagues. This meant creating the impression that Catherine was in her private quarters without actually having anyone verify her presence there. Thomas had prepared for this by adjusting the security monitoring schedule and volunteering to handle any communications that might require the princess's attention. Catherine's first destination was a small coffee shop several blocks from the palace, where she had arranged to meet Dr. Corfu. Margaret Thompson, a specialist who had agreed to see her on extremely short notice. Dr. Thompson was one of the few medical professionals in London who had experience treating high-profile patients who required absolute discretion, and she had specifically chosen to meet Catherine in a public location where their conversation would be masked by the ambient noise of a busy cafe. The medical consultation itself was both routine and extraordinary. For Catherine, it represented the first time in years that she had been able to discuss personal health concerns without worrying about how the information might be used or misinterpreted by others. Dr. Auntie Bristle. Thompson treated her exactly like any other patient, asking direct questions and providing honest answers without the careful diplomacy that usually characterized the princess's interactions with medical professionals. The conversation lasted for over an hour, during which Catherine felt a sense of normalcy that she hadn't experienced since before her marriage into the royal family. Meanwhile, Thomas was managing an increasingly complex web of small deceptions back at the palace. He had already deflected 3 different requests for the princess's attention, claiming that she had specifically asked not to be disturbed during her rest period. Each interaction required careful calibration. He needed to be convincing enough to avoid further questions, while not being so emphatic that he raised suspicions about why Catherine's privacy was so important on this particular afternoon. The most challenging moment came when Detective Inspector Sarah Mills approached Thomas to discuss the security arrangements for the princess's upcoming engagement. Sarah was known for her attention to detail and her ability to detect inconsistencies in security protocols, making her the person Thomas most wanted to avoid during Catherine's absence. The conversation required all of Thomas's experience and training as he provided updates on the princess's schedule while carefully avoiding any details that would require him to confirm her actual location. Catherine's second stop was a small bookstore in Bloomsbury, where she had arranged to meet Dr. James Richardson, a psychologist who specialized in helping people cope with the psychological pressures of public life. This consultation had been even more difficult to arrange than the medical appointment, as Dr. Richardson typically required extensive background checks and security clearances before meeting with high-profile clients. However, Catherine's desperate need for confidential psychological support had convinced him to make an exception to his usual procedures. The conversation with Dr. Richardson proved to be even more valuable than Catherine had hoped. For the first time in months, she was able to discuss the psychological toll of constant public scrutiny without worrying about how her words might be interpreted or used against her. Dr. Richardson helped her understand that her desire for privacy and autonomy was not only normal but essential for her mental health, and he provided practical strategies for maintaining her psychological well-being while fulfilling her royal duties. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself managing an increasingly elaborate performance back at the palace. He had successfully maintained the illusion that Catherine was resting in her private quarters, but each passing hour brought new challenges and potential complications. Other staff members were beginning to notice his unusually attentive monitoring of the East Corridor, and he had to create plausible explanations for his heightened vigilance that wouldn't reveal the true reason for his concern. The final phase of Catherine's clandestine journey involved a brief shopping expedition to replace some personal items that she had been unable to purchase through normal channels, due to the extensive security requirements that typically accompanied her public appearances. This simple act of browsing through a department store and making purchases without creating a media spectacle felt revolutionary to someone who had become accustomed to every shopping trip becoming a public event. Catherine's return journey to the palace required the same precision and timing that had characterized her departure. She retraced her route through London's streets, timing her arrival to coincide with the evening shift change that would provide another brief window of opportunity for her to re-enter the palace undetected. Thomas had spent the afternoon carefully monitoring the security systems and staff movements to ensure that the return route would be as safe as the departure had been. As Catherine approached the east entrance, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The few hours of freedom had reminded her of what normal life could feel like, but they had also highlighted how constrained her usual existence had become. She realized that this brief escape had been necessary not just for addressing her immediate medical and psychological needs, but for preserving her sense of personal identity in a role that often seemed to require the complete sublimation of individual desires and concerns. The reunion between Catherine and Thomas at the east entrance was brief, but emotionally charged. Both of them understood that they had successfully completed something that should have been impossible, and both of them were acutely aware that their actions could have serious consequences if they were ever discovered. However, they also shared a sense of accomplishment and mutual respect that came from having worked together to address a genuine need that couldn't have been met through conventional channels. The security camera footage from that afternoon would eventually become one of the most scrutinized pieces of evidence in royal protection history, though nobody realized its significance for several weeks after Catherine's clandestine outing. The automated recording systems had captured fragments of unusual movement patterns throughout the palace, subtle anomalies that would only become apparent when analyzed by specialists who understood the normal rhythms of royal security operations. Detective Inspector Sarah Mills first noticed something unusual 3 days after Catherine's secret escape, when she was conducting her weekly review of security protocols and staff performance. As head of the princess's protection detail, Sarah made it a practice to randomly sample security footage to identify potential vulnerabilities in their defensive procedures. On this particular morning, she was examining the recordings from the East Corridor when she noticed a brief sequence that didn't match the expected patterns of movement and positioning. The footage showed Thomas Hartwell engaging in what appeared to be an extended conversation with Princess Catherine near the east entrance, but the timestamp and duration of their interaction didn't correspond with any scheduled security briefing or official engagement. Sarah replayed the sequence several times, noting subtle details that struck her as inconsistent with normal palace operations. The princess appeared to be carrying personal items that weren't typical for her usual movement through the palace corridors, and Thomas's body language suggested a level of tension that was unusual for routine interactions. Thomas, meanwhile, was experiencing the psychological aftermath of his decision to assist Catherine's escape. The days following the incident were filled with hypervigilance and anxiety as he waited for any sign that their operation had been detected. Every casual conversation with colleagues felt like a potential interrogation, and every security briefing seemed to contain hidden meanings and veiled accusations. He found himself analyzing the facial expressions and tone of voice of everyone around him, searching for indications that someone suspected his involvement in an unauthorized breach of protocol. Catherine was dealing with her own set of psychological challenges as she attempted to return to normal royal duties while processing the emotional impact of her brief taste of freedom. The medical and psychological consultations she had attended during her escape had provided valuable insights and treatment options, but they had also highlighted the extent to which her current lifestyle was contributing to her stress and anxiety. She found herself constantly comparing her official engagements with the simple pleasure of walking through London without an entourage, and the contrast made her regular responsibilities feel even more constraining than before. The first real test of their secret came during a routine security meeting 4 days after the escape, when Sarah Mills began asking pointed questions about staff assignments and patrol schedules for the previous week. She had obviously been studying the security footage more carefully, and her questions seemed designed to identify discrepancies between official records and actual staff movements. Thomas found himself providing detailed explanations for his activities, trying to maintain consistency with the cover story he and Catherine had prepared, while avoiding any statements that could be easily contradicted by electronic records or witness testimony. Catherine's behavior during this period was equally challenging to maintain. She had to act naturally during public engagements while concealing her newfound awareness of how confined her life had become. The princess found herself paying closer attention to exit routes and security procedures, not because she was planning another escape, but because she now understood how much effort was required to maintain the protective barriers that surrounded her. This heightened awareness sometimes manifested in subtle changes in her demeanor that didn't go unnoticed by the people who worked closely with her. The situation became significantly more complicated when a tabloid photographer claimed to have captured images of someone who looked remarkably like Princess Catherine at a London coffee shop on the afternoon in question. The photographs were grainy and inconclusive, taken from a distance by someone who hadn't realized the potential significance of their subject until several days later. However, the timing and location of the alleged sighting created a potential crisis that could expose the entire operation if the images were verified and published. Sarah Mills was assigned to investigate the photographer's claims as part of her routine responsibilities for monitoring potential security breaches and media threats. Her investigation involved interviewing the photographer, examining the original digital files, and attempting to verify the location and timing of the alleged sighting. The process required her to account for Catherine's whereabouts during the relevant time period, which brought her into direct contact with Thomas and his carefully constructed cover story. The interview between Sarah and Thomas became a chess match of questions and answers, with each participant trying to gather information while revealing as little as possible about their own knowledge and suspicions. Sarah asked about Catherine's activities on the afternoon in question, while Thomas provided responses that were technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. He confirmed that the princess had been resting in her private quarters during the relevant time period, but he avoided providing specific details that could be independently verified or contradicted. Catherine was informed about the photographer's claims during a private security briefing that felt more like an interrogation. Sarah Mills explained the potential threat to royal security and asked the princess to provide a detailed account of her activities on the afternoon in question. Catherine found herself in the difficult position of having to lie directly to someone whose job was to protect her, knowing that any inconsistencies in her story could expose Thomas to serious consequences and potentially end his career. The princess's response to Sarah's questions was carefully calibrated to provide enough detail to seem credible while avoiding specific claims that could be easily investigated. She confirmed that she had been resting in her private quarters, mentioned that she had requested privacy during that time period, and expressed surprise that anyone would think she had been seen in public without her security detail. Catherine's years of training in diplomatic communications served her well during this conversation, allowing her to deflect questions without appearing evasive or defensive. Thomas spent sleepless nights considering the potential consequences of discovery, knowing that his assistance in Catherine's escape could result in criminal charges for breach of royal security protocols. He had violated his oath of service and endangered a member of the royal family, even though his actions had been motivated by concern for Catherine's well-being rather than any malicious intent. The psychological pressure of maintaining his silence while continuing to perform his duties became increasingly difficult as the investigation continued. The breakthrough in Sarah's investigation came when she decided to conduct a more detailed analysis of the palace's electronic security systems for the relevant time period. The automated logs showed subtle anomalies in the east entrance monitoring systems that corresponded exactly with the time when Catherine would have needed to leave and return to the palace undetected. These technical irregularities were too specific and well-timed to be coincidental, suggesting that someone with knowledge of the security systems had deliberately created opportunities for unauthorized access. Sarah's discovery of the electronic evidence transformed her investigation from a routine inquiry into a serious internal security matter. She realized that someone within the protection detail had assisted in what appeared to be an unauthorized departure from the palace, and the timing and methodology suggested careful planning rather than a spontaneous decision. The detective inspector found herself facing the uncomfortable possibility that one of her own team members had compromised royal security. Even if their motivations might have been benevolent, the confrontation between Sarah and Thomas was inevitable once the electronic evidence clearly pointed to deliberate manipulation of the security systems. Sarah approached Thomas privately, presenting him with the technical data and giving him an opportunity to explain his actions before she escalated the matter to higher authorities. The conversation was professional but tense, with both participants understanding that Thomas's career and possibly his freedom hung in the balance. Thomas's decision to confess was influenced by several factors, including his respect for Sarah's professionalism, his understanding that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his belief that continuing to deny his involvement would only make the situation worse for both himself and Catherine. He provided a complete account of his actions, emphasizing that he had been motivated by concern for the princess's well-being and that Catherine had taken full responsibility for requesting his assistance. The revelation of Thomas's confession created a crisis that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the escape plan. Sarah Mills found herself in the difficult position of having to balance her duty to report security breaches with her understanding of the circumstances that had motivated those breaches. She recognized that Catherine's need for medical privacy was legitimate, and that Thomas's actions, while technically improper, had been motivated by genuine concern rather than malicious intent. Catherine was informed of Thomas's confession during an emergency security briefing that felt like a courtroom proceeding. She listened to the details of the investigation and Thomas's admission of guilt with growing anxiety, knowing that her decision to seek private medical care had potentially destroyed the career of someone who had only been trying to help her. The princess realized that she would have to make difficult decisions about how to handle the situation while minimizing the consequences for Thomas and maintaining the integrity of the royal security system. The days following Thomas's confession were filled with high-level meetings and consultations as senior royal officials struggled to determine how to respond to this unprecedented breach of security protocols. The situation was complicated by the fact that Catherine's actions had been motivated by legitimate personal needs, that Thomas's assistance had been requested rather than voluntary, and that no actual harm had resulted from the unauthorized departure. However, the precedent of allowing such actions to go unpunished could potentially encourage future security breaches with more serious consequences. Catherine's most difficult decision involved whether to publicly acknowledge her role in the incident, potentially exposing her private medical needs to public scrutiny, in order to protect Thomas from the full consequences of his actions. The princess understood that taking full responsibility for requesting Thomas's assistance might mitigate his punishment, but it would also require her to reveal personal information that she had risked everything to keep private. The choice between protecting her privacy and protecting someone who had helped her created an ethical dilemma that had no clear resolution. The emergency meeting convened in the oak-paneled conference room at Buckingham Palace brought together the most senior figures in royal security and palace administration. Present were the private secretary to the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Master of the Household, Detective Chief Inspector Robert Whitfield, who oversaw all royal protection operations, and several other officials whose careers had been built on maintaining the delicate balance between royal privacy and public security. The atmosphere in the room was tense as they grappled with a situation that had no precedent in modern royal history. Detective Inspector Sarah Mills presented her findings with the clinical precision that had made her one of the most respected figures in royal protection. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Thomas Hartwell had deliberately compromised security protocols to assist Princess Catherine in leaving the palace undetected. The electronic logs, security camera footage, and Thomas's own confession painted a clear picture of premeditated action that violated every principle of royal protection. However, the motivations behind these actions complicated any straightforward assessment of guilt or appropriate punishment. Catherine sat in the conference room, listening to the detailed analysis of her secret escape with a mixture of admiration and horror. She was impressed by the thoroughness of the investigation and the professional competence of the people whose job it was to protect her. But she was also appalled by the potential consequences that Thomas might face for what had essentially been an act of kindness. The princess had not fully understood the extent to which her simple request for assistance would violate established protocols and potentially end the career of someone who had only wanted to help her address a personal health concern. Thomas Hartwell had been suspended from active duty, pending the outcome of the investigation, and he spent his days at home contemplating the wreckage of a career that had been his primary source of identity and purpose for over 15 years. His family was struggling to understand how their husband and father, known for his unwavering integrity and dedication to duty, had made a decision that could result in criminal prosecution and financial ruin. The psychological toll of waiting for official judgment while dealing with the disappointment and confusion of his loved ones was almost unbearable. The legal implications of the situation were complex and potentially far-reaching. The Crown Prosecution Service would need to determine whether Thomas's actions constituted a criminal breach of security that warranted prosecution, or whether the circumstances surrounding his decision justified treating this as an internal disciplinary matter. The precedent established by this case would influence how similar situations might be handled in the future, making every decision about Thomas's fate a matter of significant legal and administrative importance. Catherine's private consultations with her personal legal advisors revealed the full scope of the dilemma she faced. If she remained silent about her role in requesting Thomas's assistance, he would likely face the full consequences of his actions without any mitigation for the circumstances that had motivated his decision. However, if she publicly acknowledged that she had asked for his help, she would not only expose her private medical concerns to public scrutiny, but also potentially face her own disciplinary measures for compromising royal security protocols. The media attention surrounding the photographer's claims had intensified significantly once rumors began circulating about an internal investigation into royal security procedures. Several tabloids were publishing speculative stories about potential security breaches, and investigative journalists were actively trying to identify the specific incidents that had triggered the official review. The pressure to provide public clarification was mounting, but any official statement would need to balance transparency with the legitimate need to protect operational security details. Prince William's involvement in the decision-making process added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. As Catherine's husband, he understood and sympathized with her need for medical privacy, but as a future king, he also recognized the importance of maintaining security protocols that protected not just his family, but the entire monarchy. His conversations with Catherine during this period were fraught with tension as they struggled to find a solution that would protect Thomas while maintaining the integrity of the security system that safeguarded their lives. The turning point in the crisis came when Catherine made the decision to request a private meeting with Detective Chief Inspector Whitfield, the senior official responsible for making recommendations about Thomas's future. The princess had concluded that she could not allow someone else to face severe consequences for actions that she had specifically requested, regardless of the personal cost to herself. Her decision to intervene directly in the disciplinary process was unprecedented and created additional complications for officials who were already struggling with an unusual situation. Catherine's meeting with Detective Chief Inspector Whitfield was conducted with the formality appropriate to such a serious matter, but it was also infused with the emotional weight of someone taking responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond her own situation. The princess provided a complete account of her motivations for seeking Thomas's assistance, emphasizing that he had initially resisted her request and had only agreed to help after she had made it clear that she would take full responsibility for any consequences. Catherine argued that punishing Thomas severely for responding to a direct request from a member of the royal family would create an impossible situation for future security personnel who might find themselves caught between conflicting duties. The princess's intervention created a new dynamic in the official deliberations about Thomas's fate. Her willingness to accept responsibility for the security breach shifted the focus from Thomas's violation of protocols to the broader question of how the royal protection system should handle situations where legitimate personal needs conflicted with standard security procedures. Catherine's actions forced officials to consider whether the existing protocols were adequate for addressing the complex realities of modern royal life, where public scrutiny made it increasingly difficult to maintain personal privacy. Thomas learned about Catherine's intervention through his union representative, who had been monitoring the official proceedings and keeping him informed of developments that might affect his case. The knowledge that the princess was actively working to protect him from the consequences of his decision was both gratifying and troubling. He appreciated her loyalty and sense of responsibility, but he was concerned that her involvement might create additional problems for someone who was already dealing with intense public scrutiny. The deliberations among senior palace officials stretched over several weeks as they considered precedents, consulted with legal experts, and attempted to develop a response that would address the immediate situation while establishing appropriate guidelines for future incidents. The discussions were complicated by the fact that traditional approaches to security breaches didn't adequately account for cases where the breach had been requested by the person being protected, creating a legal and administrative gray area that required careful navigation. The media pressure intensified when investigative journalists began piecing together information from multiple sources and publishing increasingly accurate accounts of what had actually occurred. While the specific details remained unclear to outside observers, the general outline of a security breach involving Princess Catherine and a member of her protection detail was becoming public knowledge. The palace found itself in the difficult position of needing to provide some form of official response while protecting both operational security details and the privacy rights of the individuals involved. Catherine's decision to authorize a limited public statement acknowledging her role in the incident represented a significant sacrifice of personal privacy in service of protecting Thomas from the full consequences of his actions. The statement, carefully crafted by palace communications experts, confirmed that the princess had requested assistance with a private matter that required temporary deviation from standard security procedures, and that the staff member involved had acted in response to her specific request rather than on his own initiative. The public response to Catherine's statement was surprisingly positive, with many people expressing sympathy for her desire to maintain some level of personal privacy and praising her willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of her actions. Editorial writers and royal commentators generally supported the princess's position that members of the royal family should be able to address personal health matters without having every detail become public knowledge. This public support created political pressure for a lenient resolution to Thomas's disciplinary case. Thomas's final meeting with the disciplinary panel was conducted in an atmosphere of relative optimism, as it had become clear that Catherine's intervention and the positive public response to her statement had significantly improved his prospects for avoiding the most severe potential consequences. The panel's decision would still determine his future career prospects and financial security, but the possibility of criminal prosecution had been effectively eliminated by the princess's public acknowledgement of her role in requesting his assistance. The resolution of Thomas's case established important precedents for how similar situations might be handled in the future, while also highlighting the need for updated protocols that could better accommodate the legitimate privacy needs of royal family members. The outcome represented a careful balance between maintaining security standards and recognizing the human realities of people who lived under constant public scrutiny. For Catherine, the experience had provided valuable insights into the complexities of her position and the importance of finding sustainable ways to maintain her personal well-being while fulfilling her royal responsibilities. The aftermath of the incident would influence royal security procedures for years to come, as officials worked to develop more flexible approaches that could better accommodate the personal needs of royal family members while maintaining appropriate safety standards. Catherine's brief escape had exposed fundamental tensions between privacy rights and security requirements that would require ongoing attention and periodic revision of established protocols. The courage she had shown in taking responsibility for the consequences of her actions had also demonstrated the kind of leadership and personal integrity that would serve her well in her future role as Queen Consort. The disciplinary hearing that would determine Thomas Hartwell's professional future took place in a secure conference room at Scotland Yard, attended by senior officials from both the Metropolitan Police and the Royal Protection Unit. The formal proceedings contrasted sharply with the personal relationships and human emotions that had created this situation, as legal and administrative procedures attempted to address a crisis that had grown from someone's simple desire for medical privacy and another person's willingness to help. Thomas sat at the conference table wearing his dress uniform for what might be the last time, listening as his 15-year career was dissected and analyzed by people who had never faced the impossible choice between following orders and responding to a direct request from a member of the royal family. The charges against him were serious, deliberate compromise of security protocols, unauthorized assistance in bypassing safety measures, and failure to report a potential security breach. However, the circumstances surrounding these actions had created a level of uncertainty about appropriate punishment that was unprecedented in royal protection history. Catherine had requested permission to provide testimony at the hearing, a highly unusual step that required approval from multiple levels of palace administration and government officials. Her presence at a disciplinary proceeding involving one of her protection officers was without precedent, but her insistence that she bore responsibility for Thomas's actions had convinced authorities that her testimony was essential for reaching a fair resolution. The princess had prepared extensively for this appearance, working with legal advisors to ensure that her statements would be both truthful and effective in demonstrating the circumstances that had led to Thomas's decision. The testimony phase of the hearing began with Detective Inspector Sarah Mills providing a detailed account of her investigation and the evidence that had led to the discovery of the unauthorized palace exit. Her presentation was professional and thorough, establishing the facts of the case without editorial commentary about motivations or appropriate punishment. Sarah's obvious respect for Thomas's previous service record and her acknowledgement of the unusual circumstances surrounding this incident helped establish a tone of fairness that would influence the subsequent proceedings. Thomas's own testimony was perhaps the most compelling element of the hearing, as he provided a complete account of his decision-making process and the factors that had convinced him to assist Catherine, despite his initial reluctance. He spoke about his duty to protect the people in his care, not just from physical threats but from psychological harm that could result from the complete loss of personal autonomy and privacy. Thomas emphasized that his actions had been motivated by professional assessment, that Catherine's mental health was suffering under the current security regime, and that a brief period of supervised independence might actually enhance her long-term safety and well-being. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when Catherine took the stand to provide her own account of the events leading up to her secret escape. The princess spoke with remarkable candor about the psychological pressures of royal life, the difficulty of maintaining personal health and privacy under constant scrutiny, and her specific reasons for believing that a private medical consultation was necessary for her well-being. Her testimony revealed the human cost of the security measures designed to protect her, while also demonstrating her understanding of the risks that Thomas had taken on her behalf. Catherine's description of her conversations with Thomas painted a picture of a dedicated professional who had struggled with conflicting duties before ultimately choosing to prioritize her immediate welfare over abstract security protocols. The princess emphasized that Thomas had not acted recklessly or selfishly, but had made a carefully considered decision to help her address a legitimate need that couldn't be met through official channels. Her testimony made it clear that any punishment of Thomas would essentially be punishment for responding appropriately to a direct request from someone he was sworn to protect. The hearing also included testimony from medical and psychological experts, who provided context for Catherine's need for privacy and autonomy in addressing personal health concerns. These witnesses explained that the psychological impact of constant surveillance and public scrutiny could create genuine health problems that required professional attention, and that the ability to seek such attention confidentially was essential for effective treatment. Their testimony helped establish that Catherine's request for assistance had been based on legitimate medical needs, rather than simple desire for recreational freedom. The deliberations following the testimony phase stretched over several days as the panel considered legal precedents, security implications, and the unique circumstances that had created this situation. The officials involved understood that their decision would establish guidelines for how similar cases might be handled in the future, making it essential to balance individual circumstances with broader institutional needs. The pressure to reach a fair and defensible resolution was intensified by media attention and public interest in the outcome. Thomas spent the deliberation period in a state of anxious uncertainty, knowing that his career, reputation, and financial security depended on the judgment of people who had never faced the specific ethical dilemma that had led to his current situation. His family struggled to maintain normal routines while dealing with the stress of not knowing whether their primary breadwinner would be able to continue in his chosen profession. The psychological toll of waiting for official judgment while dealing with public scrutiny and professional uncertainty was almost unbearable. Catherine used this period to reflect on the broader implications of her secret escape and its aftermath. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about the complexity of her position and the unintended consequences that could result from seemingly simple personal decisions. She had gained new appreciation for the people whose job it was to protect her, while also developing a clearer understanding of her own needs and rights within the constraints of royal life. The panel's final decision represented a carefully crafted compromise that acknowledged both the seriousness of Thomas's protocol violations and the exceptional circumstances that had motivated his actions. Thomas received an official reprimand and temporary demotion that would affect his pay and advancement prospects, but he was allowed to remain in Royal Protection Service. The decision included specific recognition that his actions had been motivated by legitimate concern for Catherine's welfare and had been taken in response to her direct request for assistance. The outcome satisfied most of the stakeholders involved in this complex situation. Thomas retained his career and professional identity while accepting appropriate consequences for his violation of established protocols. Catherine achieved her goal of protecting someone who had helped her while demonstrating her understanding of the institutional requirements that governed royal security. The palace administration established precedents for handling similar situations while maintaining the integrity of security procedures that protected the royal family. The public reaction to the hearing's outcome was generally positive, with most commentators praising the decision as fair and reasonable given the unique circumstances involved. Editorial writers and royal experts noted that the case had highlighted important issues about privacy rights and security requirements that would need ongoing attention as the monarchy adapted to changing social expectations and technological capabilities. The resolution was seen as evidence that traditional institutions could evolve to address modern challenges while maintaining their essential functions. The longer-term implications of Catherine's secret escape extended far beyond the immediate consequences for the individuals involved. Palace officials began reviewing existing security protocols to identify opportunities for greater flexibility in accommodating the legitimate personal needs of royal family members. The incident had demonstrated that rigid adherence to standard procedures could sometimes create problems rather than solving them, leading to calls for more nuanced approaches that balanced security requirements with human needs. Thomas returned to active duty with a new understanding of the complexities involved in protecting people who lived under extraordinary public scrutiny. His experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of communication and the need for security procedures that could accommodate legitimate personal requirements. The respect and gratitude he had earned from Catherine and other royal family members for his willingness to help in a difficult situation would influence his approach to future challenges in royal protection. Catherine emerged from this experience with greater confidence in her ability to advocate for her own needs while maintaining her commitment to royal duties and responsibilities. The successful resolution of Thomas's case had demonstrated that it was possible to address legitimate personal concerns without compromising the institutional integrity of the monarchy. Her willingness to take responsibility for the consequences of her actions had earned respect from palace officials, protection personnel, and the general public. The precedents established by this case would influence royal security procedures for decades to come, creating frameworks for handling situations where standard protocols might not adequately address the complex realities of modern royal life. The balance between security requirements and personal autonomy would remain an ongoing challenge, but the resolution of Catherine's secret escape had provided valuable guidance for future decision-making. The courage and integrity demonstrated by all the participants in this unusual situation had shown that traditional institutions could adapt to meet contemporary challenges while preserving their essential values and functions. The story of Catherine's secret escape would become a defining moment in her evolution as a public figure, demonstrating her commitment to both personal authenticity and institutional responsibility. The experience had strengthened her relationship with the protection personnel, who safeguarded her family while also establishing her reputation as someone who would stand by people who had helped her. These qualities would serve her well throughout her future career as a senior member of the royal family, and eventually as queen consort.